Life outside Eden, learning to live east of the garden. The world beyond Eden did not welcome Adam and Eve gently. The air felt heavier. The ground felt harder beneath their feet. Silence felt different, less peaceful, more uncertain. They had not stepped into chaos, but into resistance. For the first time, Adam felt the earth push back against him. Soil that once yielded willingly now demanded effort. Thorns appeared where fruit once grew freely. Sweat became the price of bread. Work, once an act of joy, became a struggle for survival. Yet Adam worked. Not because the ground was kind, but because life had to continue. Every seed he planted carried both frustration and faith. The earth reminded him daily of what had been lost, but also of what remained. God had not removed humanity's purpose, only changed the cost of fulfilling it. Eve felt the fall differently. Life grew within her, just as God had said it would, but now it came with pain. Every contraction reminded her of fragility, yet every cry of new life echoed promise. Pain and hope became inseparable. Where sorrow entered, life still followed. Humanity began with birth marked by suffering, and sustained by love. Adam and Eve learned what it meant to live without the visible nearness they once knew. God no longer walked beside them in the cool of the day, yet his presence had not vanished. It had changed. He was now known through memory, through conscience, through quiet trust rather than constant sight. Faith replaced familiarity. They taught their children about the garden, not as myth, but as memory. Eden became a story told by firelight, carried in voices weighted with longing. Their children never saw the place of perfect harmony, yet they inherited the ache for it. And that ache shaped them. Their sons grew up under the same sky, but not under the same innocence. Cain and Abel learned work and worship, effort and offering. Humanity's brokenness did not wait long to show itself. Jealousy followed comparison. Anger followed rejection. Violence followed unchecked desire. The first death came not from nature, but from choice. When Abel fell, Adam and Eve understood something devastating. The fall was not a single event, it was a condition. Brokenness multiplied itself. Sin did not remain personal, it spread relationally. Yet even then, God did not withdraw. He confronted. He restrained. He preserved. Life outside Eden was not godless, it was wounded. Humanity began to expand across the land. Cities were built. Skills were learned. Music was composed. Tools were forged. Creativity survived the fall, even if purity did not. The image of God in humanity was damaged, but not erased. People learned to call upon God again. Altars rose where Eden once stood in memory. Sacrifice became language, a way of acknowledging brokenness and longing for restoration. Humanity learned that approaching God required humility, trust, and hope. Life outside Eden was marked by contrast. Beauty and brutality existed side by side. Love and loss walked together. Faith struggled, but survived. Adam lived long enough to see generations rise from the dust he once was. Each face carried something familiar, something divine. Even as bodies aged and died, the promise God had spoken remained alive. Humanity was learning a painful truth. Freedom without trust leads to fracture. But trust, even when costly, leads to life. Outside Eden, humans learn to choose daily. Not between fruit and hunger, but between resentment and forgiveness, pride and humility, despair and hope. And slowly, quietly, history moved forward. Not rushing back to a garden, but moving towards something greater. Life outside Eden was harder, but it was not empty. It was the place where faith was born, where hope learned endurance, where redemption began to unfold step by step. The garden was behind humanity now, but the promise was ahead. And every generation that lived, loved, failed, and hoped carried that promise forward, waiting for the day when what was lost would finally be restored, not by innocence regained, but by trust redeemed. Life outside Eden began quietly. There was no ceremony, no moment that announced, "This is exile." Adam and Eve simply woke each day to a world that no longer cooperated the way it once had. The loss of Eden was not only about geography, it was about how life felt. The earth was still beautiful, but it was no longer effortless. The sky was still vast, but it no longer felt protective. The days still passed, but they carried weight. The first lessons of a broken world. Adam learned quickly that the ground remembered the fall. Soil that once opened willingly now resisted his hands. Seeds no longer guaranteed harvest. Thorns grew where nourishment should have been. Work became unpredictable, sometimes rewarding, often exhausting. Sweat soaked the earth before bread could be taken from it. Yet Adam continued. Not because he felt hopeful every day, but because obedience still mattered. Work became an act of endurance. Every field he tilled became a quiet confession, life is harder, but God is still God. In this new world, provision was no longer immediate, it required patience. Trust was no longer automatic, it had to be chosen. Faith was no longer sight, it became perseverance. Even the cost of life. Eve carried the fall within her own body. Pregnancy was no longer simply wonder, it was risk. Birth was no longer painless, it was suffering intertwined with joy. Every cry of childbirth reminded her that life would now emerge through struggle. And yet, she named her children with hope. Each birth carried expectation. The promise spoken in the garden echoed in her heart. Could this be the one? Eve did not know how redemption would come, but she believed it would. Pain did not erase purpose. Suffering did not silence hope. Life outside Eden taught Eve that love often comes at a cost, but it is worth bearing. Faith without sight. The most difficult loss was not comfort, it was closeness. God no longer walked with them in visible form. His presence was no longer heard in footsteps at evening. Instead, Adam and Eve learned to know God through memory, conscience, and trust. Faith replaced familiarity. They taught their children about God not by pointing, but by telling. Stories replaced sight. Memory replaced experience. Eden became a sacred recollection, passed down with reverence and sorrow. Their children never knew innocence, but they inherited longing. The first generation after the fall. Cain and Abel grew up in a world already fractured. They learned work early. Cain struggled with the same ground his father fought daily. Abel learned patience among living creatures. Both learned worship, not because life was perfect, but because hope needed expression. But brokenness moved faster than understanding. When jealousy overcame humility, the first human death occurred, not by nature's hand, but by choice. Abel's blood soaked the earth that had once carried God's footsteps. Adam and Eve learned then that sin was not contained. It multiplied. The fall was not a moment, it was a condition. And still, God intervened. He confronted Cain. He restrained violence from spreading unchecked. He preserved life, even flawed life. Mercy did not excuse sin, but it prevented destruction. Humanity expands, broken but brilliant. Life continued. Families multiplied. Communities formed. Humanity spread across the land. People learned skills, music, craftsmanship, agriculture, metalwork. Creativity survived the fall. Beauty still emerged from broken hands. The image of God in humanity was damaged, but not erased. People still loved deeply. They still created meaning. They still searched for God. Altars began to rise again. Sacrifice became language, acknowledging guilt, expressing hope, seeking restoration. Humanity learned that approaching God required humility. They could no longer come without awareness, but they could still come. Life east of Eden. Life outside Eden was defined by tension. Between faith and fear. Between obedience and rebellion. Between despair and hope. Some generations moved toward God. Others drifted away. Humanity learned slowly, painfully, that freedom without trust leads to destruction, but trust, even in suffering, leads to life. Adam lived long enough to see the world fill with faces that carried his likeness and God's breath. Every birth, every death, every story reminded him of both loss and promise. Eden was gone. But God was not. Life outside Eden was not punishment, it was formation. It was the place where humanity learned responsibility, where faith matured, where redemption slowly unfolded. The garden had been a beginning. The wilderness became the journey. And through toil, tears, and time, humanity carried forward the promise spoken in the garden, waiting, hoping, believing that what was lost would not remain lost forever. Life east of Eden was hard. But it was not hopeless. It was the long road home. Life east of Eden did not grow easier with time. But hearts grew deeper. Adam and Eve learned to wake each morning carrying both memory and responsibility. The garden lived behind their eyes now, not beneath their feet. They no longer walked where everything was whole, but where everything required choosing, again and again. They learned that faith was no longer effortless. It had to be remembered. Taught. Protected. Every field Adam worked reminded him of what once was, but also of what still could be. Every child Eve held carried pain in the body and hope in the soul. Life continued not because it was simple, but because it was sacred. The ache for Eden never left them. It showed itself in quiet moments, when the sky burned with color at sunset, when laughter echoed and faded too quickly, when loss came sooner than expected. The ache became a companion, not to torment them, but to remind them that this world was not the end of the story. Their children grew, stumbled, chose, and failed, just as humanity always would. And yet, beneath every failure, the promise still pulsed like a heartbeat. God had spoken. God had not forgotten. Outside the garden, faith learned endurance. Hope learned patience. Love learned sacrifice. Adam and Eve did not live to see redemption fulfilled, but they lived knowing it would come. And that was enough to walk forward, even when the road was hard. The wilderness was no longer punishment. It was preparation. And so humanity moved on. With dirt-stained hands. With hearts shaped by longing. With eyes lifted toward a future they trusted but could not yet see. Eden was behind them. But the promise walked ahead. And every step taken in faith, every choice made in hope, carried humanity closer to the day when what was lost would no longer ache, because it would be restored. Not by returning to innocence, but by arriving at redemption.